Roosevelt shows respect to his students by holding them to the highest standards. And that has always been true in my experience working with him. He makes no assumptions about what they think or feel based on what they look like. And he understands that most, if not all, of the students whom we are trying to serve through this Knowledge for Freedom network come from communities with long histories of having been demeaned and exploited for generations, and that all of them, I suspect without exception, have been disproportionately affected in their family lives and their personal lives by the pandemic that we hope is now coming to an end. And he also understands that the kind of challenging works that are on the syllabi of our courses don't belong to one group or another, but to say something, I hope not too banal, they belong to humanity. And we need to insist on that. Another thing I think I mean by saying he's a great teacher is that he is able to carry his students both backward in time into the historical moment when the text was created, both by the individual author and by the broader culture in which that author was working, and also always to connect the essential questions that the text raises to the present moment. And I think that's a rare gift in a teacher, but he's got it in spades. And I guess to come full circle to where I started, my sense is he treats the texts the same way he treats the students, which is to say, the way to show them respect is not to idolize them and assume that they are beyond reproach or beyond criticism, but in fact to hold them, the texts themselves, to the highest standards of truth telling. So that's why I'm always happy to hear Roosevelt, and I'm going to shut up in about 30 seconds. But the last thing I want to say is I'm not that used to pitching other people's books. In this case, I'm happy to do so. Roosevelt has a wonderful book coming out in the fall from Princeton University Press. Last I checked, Roosevelt, the working title was Rescuing Socrates. Is that where we are? Okay. And this is it's a combination of a personal memoir and a meditation on teaching and reading. And I hope you'll all read it. And I have high hopes that it's going to help us all get the word out about why this kind of teaching and learning is so important. So thank you all for being here. I'll stop talking and invite Roosevelt to teach us.
Andy, thank you so much for that extraordinarily generous introduction in so many dimensions. And I in saying things about the kind of teacher I am, I appreciate you giving me credit for succeeding at those things, but I think what you're describing is what we try to do in the classroom. That is the kinds of things that make the kind of teaching that we're doing effective and transformative for the student. So thanks, and I think I want to talk a little bit about some of those themes, in fact. So what I want to talk today is primarily about teaching these texts and then teaching DuBois specifically. And I want to spend a little bit of time kind of just framing the way that I approach not just DuBois, but all of the texts that we teach in the seminar. That is kind of more broadly the kinds of pedagogical practices that I have found to be effective in this format. Because this, to say the obvious, teaching this type of program to this population presents specific pedagogical challenges and very kind of high pedagogical challenges. It is a kind of, it demands a kind of deliberate effort and attention to pedagogical issues that are normal undergraduate teaching does not call of us, require of us, nor of course our graduate teaching. So let me begin by making two general statements about the kind of thing that I have found to be effective in this type of classroom. And I've been now, we started a program in 2009, so and I've taught it every summer since. So I'm now somewhere in the 12th year. So some of these things I have seen work in the classroom. So take them in that context. So the first thing is that the most important thing that we do, most important thing that one does in a classroom like this is establish a certain atmosphere. And I can't emphasize how important that is. Nothing else will happen. Nothing else instructionally, constructively will happen apart from this general tone and atmosphere that you sit in the classroom. And the most important aspect of that atmosphere, in my mind, has to do with whether you're able to communicate to the students that you care about them. This is something I learned from I had a very close friend who was a middle school teacher, and middle school teaching is probably the hardest kind of teaching that one does. I mean, we've all been of middle school age, so you can imagine why. And he said the really key thing to my teaching is that I need to indicate, I need to convince them that I care. If I am able to convince them that I care about them as individuals, then I've won the day. And I've carried that, and I've seen it work in this context. And I'm not talking about like pandering to them. It's about giving them as individuals a kind of intensely interested attention. That intensely interested attention is transformative of the relationship and of the individual. If you are able to convey, and it's not, convince them, these things get communicated, it's not rational persuasion, but if you're able to convey that what you care most about is not the subject, is not the arguments, it's not the kind of specific informational content of this classroom experience, but that you're interested in engaging and seeing them as individuals grapple and process and engage with these ideas. That you're interested in something that has to do with them as individuals, not as instances of some broader category, or as recipients of a certain kind of information that you think is important. And part of what's important about communicating that kind of attention on that message is that a recognition that, unlike other kinds of teachings that we do, what is at stake in this kind of teaching is ultimately what kind of lives these students are going to live. So having that in the front of our minds as we teach, I think is hugely important. So that is the most important element of the atmosphere that I think you should try to create, or one tries to create, to make the kind of teaching we are doing effective. There are other kind of more general things, such as respecting everyone's opinion, eliciting everyone's opinion. That is, you are a kind of arbiter and referee, a kind of maintainer of a certain kind of container forum that can accommodate vulnerability, can accommodate different opinions, can accommodate whatever mood the student is in, just a container that is capacious enough to accommodate the individuals as they appear, as they are in front of you in their reality. The other thing I would say that as a general approach is to play to your strengths. Each one of us is a different kind of teacher. Each one of us has a different set of things that light them up, that put them kind of on fire. And that's what you should play to. watched, I couldn't be at our previous meeting, but I watched Brian Garston's just beautiful exposition of teaching Socrates, teaching the apology to his students. And I was just so vividly struck by that, how embedded in the way Brian thinks this approach to teaching is, and I can see how effective it is, how effective it would be. I keep thinking, I wish I said that. I wish I would do that. But then I will, next time I teach Socrates, I will incorporate for sure some of those things, but I will incorporate it into the teacher that I am. Right? I can't do what Brian does. But so play to your strengths in your teaching. Don't do what someone else does, even if someone else does it very well. Talk about what fires you up. Now, as before I point to some things about DuBois that I use and that I have found to be effective. I want to just walk you through 4 things that I do in my classes. I don't do with my undergraduates. I just do with this in this program, in the context of which DuBois comes in. So when I talk about DuBois and the kinds of conversations that we have and the passages that we look at, it all happens in the context of these 4 practices that I do in the classroom. So one is I have students write in response to every text every day before they come into my classroom. So students generally will have every night they will have a reading assignment. And then I ask them to write a 1-page response to the reading assignment, which they submit before we come to class. That first practice is important in a number of ways. One of them is that it gets them comfortable with at least a couple of things that can be said about this text that they can say about the text. It focuses their thinking and in some articulate position about the text. And that's going to be really important for what happens in the classroom, because many times what they say will have been guided and primed by the thing they wrote, sometimes just repeating the thing they wrote. But you can really see in discussion how this getting them to sit down and cogitate and formulate some ideas becomes the kind of well from which they're going to draw and which they're going to expand and develop while we're in class discussion. Another practice that I do in every class is I ask students to, when we're meeting in person, write on the board, when we did it last summer online to put in the chat, a new word and a keyword. So I guess I'm counting those things as two practices, but it's really same idea. So there will be 2 lists of words that they will write on the board or on the chat. One is going to be a list of new words, and I simply tell them, find the word that made you go to the dictionary. I do this all the time when I'm reading. It used to be that I had the big dictionary sitting next to me, and now I have my cell phone or a computer in front of me, and I am constantly looking up vocabulary words. I have a PhD in English, but I'm always doing that virtually every time I read anything new. So that kind of normalizes that experience and habituates them to the fact that you can go to the dictionary and look up the meaning of certain words. So it will put up a new word on the board. That also gives me, when I see that list of 15 words every morning, it gives me a sense of what their semantic range is, what things are coming through, what things that, it gives me a gauge of their general reading level, which is important because it guides the way I talk about text, things that I explain. It gives me a feel for where they are and what terms might require more elucidation. It helps me scaffold the text for them. Same happens with keywords. I ask them to identify a word that they think is key. And I encourage them to, there are some words that will be kind of obvious. If you're reading Hobbes, human nature might be an obvious key concept, or war, or contract, etc. I encourage them to to try to find a word that may not be obvious, but that they see as a key word that for their understanding. So they can just pick an obvious word, but kind of brownie points for picking a word that's not obviously a key word, and then you tell me why. The fourth thing that I do every day is that my basic kind of speed, the basic gear, the basic mechanism with which I teach is I go around the room every day and ask students to give me a quick response to the reading. It may be the same thing that they wrote the previous night, only I want to hear it orally, and it ought to be linked to a specific passage in the text. So I will go around the room. Everyone will give me a sentence or a passage, and typically we all turn to the passage. So it takes this, it's not quick. It takes most of the class every day. And they will say, well, here on page 64, there's this line, and this is my response. This is what it made me think, or this is what I think of it. Again, that serves a number of functions. One is getting everybody's voice in. As you all know, speaking for the first time is always the most difficult thing. Once you get your voice into a conversation, it just lowers the bar, that kind of lowers the bar of entry. It gives me a moment to connect kind of one-on-one to the student. Speaking to me, I'm speaking to them and hearing them. And of course, it does that to other students too. Other students hear the voices of other students and the things that are striking other students. So it begins to create the community of dialogue that I'm trying to create. So those are four just practices that I do every class. They will have come having written a response, which I of course will read every night and get back to them on the next day. They will write a new word. They will write a keyword, and I will go around and ask them to make a comment about any passage that might have caught their attention in a specific way. These four things help me do what I call scaffolding, which is a big part of what we do for them in this text, which is you create the kind of linguistic and conceptual scaffold that will, along which they can kind of weave their interest, along which they can kind of construct and build their interest. Sometimes I used to run Columbia's core curriculum and have been teaching in it for many years. And I'd go around different universities and audiences and talk about what we did in the core curriculum. And one of the things I often heard from people is something to the effect that, well, this works at Columbia. You can have Columbia students read Plato and Aristotle and Rousseau, but here at XY Community College, or at this liberal arts college, or at this state school, here in this different kind of university or institution that maybe would mainly teach STEM majors or whatever, our students are not really, I'm not sure they can really handle that. And I always point to freedom and citizenship. I say, well, I teach this text to high school students who are from low-income households whose parents didn't go to college. And sure, it puts a different kind of pedagogical burden on the teacher. It calls for a different set of skills. It calls for a different kind of attention to the text. But they are not inaccessible. Not only they're not inaccessible, they're not alien to the students. Students are turned on by them. Students find that they speak to them. Students find that they can engage in a real, authentic way with the ideas that they find there. One of the things that people are often shocked and surprised about when they see, sometimes, get visitors who sit in the class or observe the class, and if they come late in the semester, say in the third week, I often I often hear people being surprised about how the familiarity and the confidence with which students talk about, Plato and Aristotle and Hobbes and Thucydides. It's like they had dinner with them last night or something. And the way that they attain that is through the way they attend is through this process of reading for themselves. But the fact that they attain that is because they have connected with them in an authentic way. They have connected with the power and significance of the ideas in a way that is not an academic or intellectual exercise. It's not some kind of fancy posturing, but a real contact with them. Let me take a very quick look at where Du Bois comes in our syllabus. And for that, I'm going to share the screen. I'm going to do a screen share here of our schedule of reading. We have kept a very kind of stable set of readings that we have used since we started teaching in 2009. We always tinker with it, particularly in the third week. So we run a 3-week program that meets every day. And I'm just going to run quickly through what we do. So on the first day, in addition to introductions, will be the first of the dialogues in the collection of late Socratic dialogues, Platonic dialogues that we read, the Euthyphro. The next day, the Apology. Then the next day, the Credo, and a little excerpt from the Phaedo, the death scene, Socrates' death scene. Aristotle's Politics, Thucydides' History of the Peloponnesian War, and you see there are about 20 pages selections there. Week 2, Political Enlightenment. So social contract 1, 2, and 3, Hobbes, Locke, Rousseau, just 3 conceptions and elaborations of this basic idea of a social contract. Then we move to America towards the end of that second week with Declaration of Independence and 2 pieces from Frederick Douglass, a little bit from the narrative of the life of an American slave, and from his great speech on the meaning of the 4th of July to the Negro. Then a day on Lincoln, including the Constitution. And that moves us to the third week, which I call the American experience. We move explicitly into the way that some of these ideas have played out and continue to play out in the American context. And there goes W.E.B. Du Bois, which we read. This day is kind of too packed, but as you see, there's a declaration of sentiments from Seneca Falls, Sojourner Truth's beautiful little piece, Ain't I a Woman, and a piece from Jane Addams about women's suffrage. One of the reasons we keep tinkering with that third week is because of things like this. In this section, we try to deal with race and gender, but there's too much going on. So probably one of the things we'll try to sort out is how we unpack some of that day. But that's where Du Bois comes in. So how do I approach Du Bois when we get to this? I don't often say this explicitly, but I spend a little bit of time talking about Du Bois's biography, because Du Bois is such a paradigm, such a model of a certain kind of engaged intellectual that they're familiar with, and that kind of initiates a whole tradition specifically of Black intellectuals who use scholarship in the service of social change. That is, intellectuals who see their intellectual activity as a political activity, and that seek to transform structures of power, structures of privilege, opportunity in society using their scholarship. Other things that are interesting about Du Bois grows up in a single parent home. So his father abandons the family before he's 2. He goes to an integrated school. It's clearly a kind of a gifted student. So the the community puts together the funds. A mentor of his kind of does a GoFundMe to raise some money to send Du Bois to school, and they send them. He goes on scholarship to Fisk University in Tennessee, and that's the first time he goes south. When he goes away to college, and it's his first experience with the Jim Crow South. He transfers out of Fisk in his third year to Harvard, and finishes his bachelor's degrees at Harvard. Is one of the graduation speakers. He graduates with honors, and he then goes on to do a PhD. He started at Harvard, does a lot of the work in Germany, and then comes back and receives a PhD from Harvard at age 27, first PhD given to an African-American by Harvard. And then as one of the most educated persons in the United States, and certainly the most credentialed, academic credentialed individual, Black individual in the United States, Du Bois cannot find a job in a white institution. The first job he takes is in a Black college in the chair of classics, even though he's trained as a sociologist. So there is something about Du Bois that is kind of emblematic of a certain kind of intellectual that I want to highlight to the students. I want them to see this this way of doing scholarship. I'm quickly running out of time, so let me say just a few quick things about the essays, because I want to open up discussion for conversation, and conversation, of course, can be either about these general challenges and approaches to effective teaching, or about Du Bois. They read the forethought, the little introduction Du Bois has to the collection, and of our spiritual strivings, the first essay. I often read the first passage of the forethought, in which Du Bois addresses the reader and writes the first of three formulations, three instances in which this kind of dictum comes up. The problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. So one thing I ask students is to ask themselves about who the audience is. And that first passage from, that first sentence from the forethought, I'm going to read very quickly. Herein lie buried many things which, if read with patience, may show the strange meaning of being Black here in the dawning of the 20th century. This meaning is not without interest to you, gentle reader, for the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. Who is the audience there, and how can you get clues from that reading, like addressing the reader as gentle reader? What kinds of clues does it give you about who the audience is? And that's a question that I always insist on, and it's very productive to insist on, to get us to think about who the audience is. And of course, I asked about this idea that the problem of the 20th century is the problem of the color line. I asked them if that continues to be the problem of the 21st century, or what might be the problem of the 21st century. The next essay of our spiritual striving introduces one of the most important concepts that Du Bois contributed to the way we think about race, not just in America, but everywhere, and ultimately difference everywhere, is the concept of double consciousness. So I want them, and don't have time to go into the passage that comes early on, in which Du Bois explains double consciousness, but double consciousness is something that our students are going to be very familiar with, something that they will know from their own experience, because so many of them are in one way or another, socioeconomically, gender-wise, as immigrants, as people of color, in one, or sometimes just as nerdy kids, in one way or another marginalized from a mainstream. And this passage articulates something that is inherent in that position, in forming a sense of identity from that position. And it introduces what Du Bois calls the second sight. And I, in addition to double consciousness, I always point out Double conscious is something that takes a tremendous psychological and personal toll on you. It's a condition that in some way damages you psychologically. But DuBois talks about a sort of second sight, a point of view that position opens up a kind of insight and a way of seeing into the mainstream from the outside while being of the inside that illuminates it in ways that are also uniquely the product of this experience.